the Bad Boys Pistons teams, I think we should recognize them more as a collective, and very often people recognize them as like Isiah Thomas's team. Hello everybody, welcome to Awesome Rusty Bucket. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and drop a like on this video. It helps it do a lot better in the YouTube algorithm, so that is much appreciated. Also check us out over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you want to enjoy this as an audio only experience. We're back with Hot Take Tuesdays. We're not going to be having one next Tuesday, I believe. Or no hot takes this Friday. But anyways, let's get into it. From It's Me Flacco, athletes have the worst takes and opinions. Most guys, especially NBA guys, do little to no research about the literal league that they are in, and then talk down on people who actually know history and facts just because they aren't 6'6" with a 40-inch vertical. There's a lot of accuracy in this statement. What I hate is when the people act like an athlete's word is just inherently gospel. That doesn't even make sense, because athletes will disagree with each other constantly. So how can their word be gospel if one person thinks it isn't and one doesn't? Like, it doesn't really work that way. But there's different angles and types of knowing things. Like, I can name every NBA champion all the way back through the 1960s, but I also don't really know what the day-to-day life experience of an NBA player is. So there's different types of knowledge for different areas of discussion. But like, a lot of NBA players really do not know their history. And something that was so funny to me was DeMar DeRozan went on Paul George's podcast, and he was preaching about how, like, man, these young NBA kids these days just don't even know the history of their league. And he's like, I can name all the champions back to the 2000s. And then he starts naming them, and he gets like a third of them wrong. And he's like, man, these kids don't know. Apparently you don't know, DeMar. All of that aside, yeah, some of the worst takes I have ever heard have been from NBA players. And I think the fact that they are NBA players adds a degree of like, this is even worse because you should know better than this. I'm looking at you, Gilbert Arenas. From John Comedy, T-Mac isn't truly a legit NBA what-if because he had plenty of chances while not injured. He didn't produce and underachieved. Define plenty of chances. He had a couple of chances, but there was only a couple of years in there, maybe not even any, where there was truly enough healthy around him. Like, in Orlando, never really had enough help. He did blow a 3-1 lead, but also his head coach was Doc Rivers, so factor that in as you will. He did play worse as the series went along, so that's really the only time that I could knock him for a playoff series. Otherwise, never had enough help to win a series in Orlando. And in fucking Houston, Yao Ming was pretty much never healthy for the playoffs, or he wasn't healthy when Yao Ming was. I think there's a what if there because A, he didn't play as long as a lot of other people do due to his injury stuff, and B, he didn't have any kind of help around him. Now, I don't know if a star player not having great help is inherently a what-if scenario. I don't know. I definitely don't think T-Mac is up there in the NBA what-ifs, but if you want to consider his career a what-if, like if Tracy McGrady was on the Lakers in the 2000s instead of Kobe, maybe they still win all those championships, and then Tracy McGrady is the guy who's ranked super high all time instead of Kobe. I don't know what to tell you. I don't think he has had many chances as you think he did. From BZ Buck, any accolade involving voting is less valuable than concrete accomplishments. I think I can agree with that. However, it's not always so black and white. Like, sure, the MVP award might have a voting factor, but, you know, a championship, for example, has what was your team factor, what was your matchup factor. Like, there's always a context to consider. Like, having a ring is having a ring, but also it's not really. Like, we still value rings differently, and it's not like the rings are voted for. Or I guess if you're a conspiracy theorist, maybe they are. But I get where you're coming from. as I said in the last video, in general, I think more often than not, like at least 70+% of the time, awards end up going to the right player. From the Silent One PG, Pat Riley's negligence is one of the main reasons that the Heat's championship window has closed. If Pat could have gotten Jimmy Butler and Bam a primary scorer, I truly do think that the Heat beat the 2022 Celtics and have a chance to play against the Warriors rather than depending on Jimmy Jordan to catch lightning in a bottle every single year. I do think that there's been a couple instances of the Miami Heat falling asleep at the wheel. Pat Riley is super fucking old. I think he literally fell asleep at there was like a trade deadline where he literally fell asleep, and that was all the drama. I think the dude should probably retire. I love Pat Riley. He's one of my favorite people from NBA history, but I don't know that I would categorize him as very good at his job right now. From Pokey Pocket Poke, what a name. Manu is one of the most underrated players ever. Yes, he gets talked about a lot, but nobody really talks about what he did so well. Genuinely one of the greatest passers of all time, and being probably the most underrated one of the most underrated shooters ever. I really do believe that in the right context, Manu Ginobili could have been not quite James Harden, but like 25, 5, and 8. Like, that was very achievable for Manu. I don't even think he was that far from that stat line when he did play enough. When he was actually a starter. The first year he becomes a full-time starter for the Spurs, plays 30 minutes a game, 47% from the field, 37% from 3, 80% from the line. Oh, well, that's 16 points per game. I don't know where the fuck I got 20. Too many players to share the floor with. He did average 20 in 2008. I think dude's an excellent passer, excellent scorer, and kind of underrated as a defender. That said, I don't know what the fuck he was doing in DPOY voting in 2005. He was 18th, so it's not like he was really all that high up, but what the hell's that about? Manu, I think his talent was really limited and underutilized in San Antonio. That was a part of the allure of them, and a part of the reason they were so effective is they didn't use all of their assets and abilities to their fullest extent. Yeah, Manu's definitely underrated in my opinion because his stats do not reflect the level of talent he was. From Eric Solheim, sports betting takes the joy out of basketball. Doesn't take the joy out of it for me, but it definitely undersells it, and it's definitely very annoying how prevalent it is. We used to do sponsors for that stuff back in the day. We don't anymore. I wish it would go away, but let's be honest. Capitalism, baby. From Colin McCarthy, CP3 is better than Isiah Thomas all time. Zeke was not some all-NBA talent like many say during Detroit's championships. His rings were closer to Chauncey Billups' ring, carried by a great defense, than any Magic or Steph ring. I would agree that it is closer to Chauncey Billups, but I also do think he was literally an all-NBA talent multiple times. Yeah, 5-time all-NBA player. I'm curious how many of those are first teams. 3-time first team, 2-time second team. None of the first teams, though, and none of the second teams happened when he was winning championships. That's interesting. I didn't know that, actually. I was aware that his stats do decline in their championship years, and that is in large part because of something I talk about all the time, which is overusage, and especially overabundantly being too responsible for your team's playmaking comes to a detriment to your team. You see from 84 to 87, he's averaging double-digit assists, even peaking at 14 a game in 1985. 11 and a half with 21 points over this 321 game stretch. In 89 and 90, I believe that's the years. I'm pretty certain that's the years that they won the championship. Yeah, 89 and 90. His assists per game and scoring average goes down. No longer an all-NBA level player, at least by the NBA standards at that time. Playoff numbers, he's 41% from the field's not very good. 19 points, 8 assists, 2 steals. We're definitely talking about a good player who did good, important things for a championship level team. He was the primary playmaker and a solid defender and a good scorer. I actually think there's an argument to be made, though, that he was actually a marginally worse scorer than Joe Dumars as a whole. Let's see what his numbers for those playoff runs were. Actually, the scoring numbers are pretty similar in points per game. The assist difference is actually smaller than I would have guessed, but yeah, 18 points, 5 assists. In general, the Bad Boys Pistons teams, I think we should recognize them more as a collective, and very often people recognize them as like Isiah Thomas's team. Technically speaking, he is the only other point guard besides for Magic and Steph that have been the best player on a championship team, other than, I mean, technically you can count LeBron because in 2020 he played the point guard position, but other than that, like traditional, more, I guess Steph and Magic aren't traditional point guards either, but this team was a collective of a bunch of talent that had an egalitarian approach. You have 5 double-digit scorers, another guy who's right there in Vinnie Johnson. Great defensive player, even DPOY, I think, for one of their title run seasons. So we're talking about a very stacked team with a very good head coach who revolutionized the play style of the era, maybe devolved it depending on your perspective, but lots of really good scorers, lots of really good players, and I just don't think that, I think Isiah gets a little bit too much credit sometimes. And if we look over at Christopher Emmanuel Paul, for his peak seasons, is putting up better numbers. He was a far superior defensive player. Let's call his peak from 2008 to 2016. Multiple times high in MVP voting. 2nd, 5th, 4th, 6th, 6th, 3rd. 19 points per game, 10 assists per game, 2.5 steals per game. I also think that Chris had an overabundance of playmaking, but I also think he was better at it. If there was one thing that I do want to give Isiah a lot of credit for that he regularly does not, he kind of revolutionized ball handling in the NBA. There were guys like Pistol Pete who could do some stuff that hadn't really been seen before, but Isiah was one of the first players that truly turned dribbling from what was previously a hindrance and a weakness and just this annoying, tedious thing that you had to do to make the sport function. He turned it from that, which is mostly just a limitation, to a dramatic strength. And that change in ball handling has like fundamentally changed the aesthetics of this game. Like back when Isiah was drafted, point guards would like be posting up as soon as they passed half court, turning their back to their whoever's defending them and dribbling the ball all the way over here to keep it as far away as possible, not daring risk to face up, not daring risk to do anything resembling a crossover. So Isiah deserves a lot of credit for that, but I think Chris Paul was a better player than Isiah Thomas. Better defender, better passer, better scorer, more efficient scorer, much better three-point shooter. Yeah, I just think he was a better player. And I think if you put Chris Paul on the Bad Boy Pistons, similar results would have transpired. From Side Activists, Steph Curry is a direct answer to the mamba mentality circle jerk and the people who think that being an asshole 24/7 is cool and productive. Curry led a dynasty while not doing any of that shit. Well, like I said in the last video, because we discussed the mamba mentality type stuff, being really mean to your teammates as a source of motivation, how good or bad is that? I think it's a little silly to act like one or the other is just inherently going to be better. It really depends on the person, and I think it's better just to have a more adaptive approach that's like, okay, with this guy, I need to act this way. With this guy, I need to act this way. And I think if you are a little bit just fluid with your approach, I think that's better than just a rigid, this is how it works, this is always what works, we can't break from this. There are multiple ways to skin a cat. It's a horrible expression, but it's true. There's a lot of different ways to win NBA championships. There's a lot of different ways to build a dynasty. You don't have to be a dick. You don't necessarily have to be a nice guy either. whatever works is whatever works. And in general, I think people are just a little too declarative about what does and does not work in this sport, because there's a lot of potential options out there. The biggest snub of top 75 list was Nikola Jokic, not Clay, Dwight, or anyone else. Well, I believe, when did the 75 list came out? Before Jokic won his title, right? Yeah, that came out in 2021. So that was before he had a championship and a finals MVP and a third MVP. So we're talking about 2 MVPs, a good amount of all-NBA teams, and some pretty good stats, but not a super long tenured career. While I think Jokic should be in over Clay, Dwight Howard probably had a better and more valid case for top 75 in 2021. I understand that 2 MVPs is a lot, but 4 Defensive Player of the Years is also a lot. Leading your team to the NBA Finals without any really truly all-star level players is also a lot. Consistently being the best defense in the NBA, consistently being one of the best teams in the NBA, also a lot. Jokic has been leading teams, not for his fault, as we would eventually learn. I already knew, but people would eventually learn. It was a factor of just having a bad team, but he hadn't had a ton of playoff success. He won some MVPs with two seasons where he won less than 50 games. I understand why that ended up happening. I do think that he deserves it more than Clay. I'm going to disagree on Dwight, though. This is an interesting take. From Cheem. If Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals in 2006 happened for a LeBron team instead of those Lakers, it would be a larger bad mark on his legacy than 2011. People don't use that against Kobe's legacy like they would if it happened to LeBron. I mean, that's the game that's blatantly rigged, or at least according to a lot of people, blatantly rigged, right? I believe so, against the Sacramento Kings. I feel like losing in the yeah, that's something that gets talked about a lot as yeah, that was fraudulent. That shit shouldn't have happened. You should use that to knock the Lakers dynasty. That argument happens. However, losing a final series you were heavily favored in is just much worse for your legacy than a single game being considered rigged. And while I think it's fair to say that for LeBron that would get brought up more, I actually don't even know if I do agree with that, because in 2002 we weren't in our social media era. I think a big reason why 2011 hurts LeBron so much is that it happened right on the cusp of the social media era, and it was recent enough in history that when we did really get in the thralls of the social media era in 2014, 2015, it was in recent enough history and in most of people's memories. 2002, I feel like a lot of the argument about that game being rigged has actually happened more in recent years and has become more prevalent of a talking point now than it was back then. So that factor kind of makes me feel differently about that. Do I think if LeBron had a series rigged for him, he would get more flack for it than Kobe and the Lakers? Sure. But I don't think it would be a worse mark than 2011. I think you are underselling how bad 2011 is for his legacy. From Patrick 05 Morgan, Stephen Curry is more skilled than Kyrie Irving. The gap in their shooting ability in favor of Steph is greater than the gap Kyrie benefits from any other area. Curry used his skill in a far more effective way, and they are both the same size. I really feel like a lot of people think that skill is just simply the amount of abilities you can do well, but if you can do one ability way better than literally anybody else fucking ever can, that weighs a lot more than being able to do 2 things well. You know what I'm saying? It scales depending on the ability, especially depending on how important that ability is to the type of player you are. And if you're a shot creator, a high volume shooter, as Kyrie Irving and especially Steph are, well, being the greatest shooter of all time is a lot better than being a very good one. So yeah, Steph is definitely more skilled than Kyrie Irving. I recognize that a lot of people argue that Kyrie's like the most skilled player ever, but I'm sorry, that's fucking ridiculous. Just because you can do a lot of dribbles and just because you shoot well and you have a fancy layup package does not mean that your skill set as a collective is better than that of a player who is supremely elite at something that you are not. Kyrie is actually probably one of the best three-point shooters of his generation. Like, he's a very good shooter on good volume himself. But he ain't Stephen Curry, and even as it relates to the other areas of the game, ball handling, finishing, playmaking, I think Steph is a far more skilled playmaker. I think he is not as good of a ball handler because no one is, but as close as you really can be. And finishing-wise, Kyrie might have a more fancy layup package, but I'm willing to bet their efficiency and volume at the rim is relatively similar. Maybe Steph doesn't do as many jelly layups as Kyrie Irving does, but again, we're getting caught up in aesthetics and not actual ability that tangibly matters for how good you are at the game of basketball. And as it relates to those things and not just bag talk, yeah, Steph is definitely more skilled than Kyrie Irving. From Spawn3582, just because you've played professional/college ball does not mean you always have more knowledge or a better understanding of the game than those who haven't. A lot of players are great at what they do instinctively, but couldn't break the game down as effectively as they play it. Yeah, this ties back to the earlier take about NBA players or former athletes having bad takes. There's different skill sets and different aspects of this game where they excel and others excel. Like, the reason that coaches are even a thing is because even if you are really good at basketball, you might still need to be steered in the right direction to be the most effective. And someone like Greg Popovich, who's not a very good basketball player, I think he played in high school a little bit, he's one of the greatest basketball minds there's ever been. I don't think Tex Winter was an NBA player either, as far as I recall. He's one of the greatest basketball minds that have ever lived. It's not just about being able to play the sport. That is a different skill set than understanding it. Now, physically playing in it does help you understand it more. Like, playing chess will probably give you a better idea of what chess is like than if you watch people play chess or instruct someone else to make moves. That bird's eye view is also helpful, and that perspective from someone who isn't in it but can look at it holistically more than you can while you're in the heat of the moment, that is also very valuable, and that is an ability that I think is being dramatically dismissed when you make this argument that you're just inherently going to be more knowledgeable in the game if you played it. And the reality is, there is a lot of NBA players that I could fucking school as it relates to some NBA trivia, and probably one here or there that I actually know more about the game itself. Most of the time, that's not the case, but every once in a while, you get a dude who's just purely vibes and doesn't really understand how the game itself works. Those dudes don't end up being very successful, but they do exist for sure. Like, someone I would think of as like fucking Antonio Blakeney or Denzel Valentine. I think I might have a better understanding of the game of basketball than them, even if they are much better at it than I am. Being good at it and understanding it, not inherently the same thing. Ooh, this is an interesting take from Guga. Part of the reason the league is so balanced now is because a lot of teams just gave up when the Warriors were the best, and now it's all coming together for a lot of them. Yeah, I do think that is a decent argument that there's a lot of teams that were like, okay, well, clearly our timeline is not anywhere between the years of 2015 and 2018. So let's just dial it back a little bit. Let's take a little bit of a longer term approach, a little bit more of a growth mindset to this thing. Yeah, a lot of the teams that made those choices are cashing in on that very thing right now. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good argument. From Sebastian the Bass, hot take, Paolo Banchero is the most underrated player in the whole league. Explanation: with how full of stars the league is, I get it, but I see no news on him, while Derek White, while a good player, gets more media attention. Shaq got more attention playing for the same team which at the same time was Dookie before Shaq. I think he got more attention because he was a lot better than Paolo is. So that's probably one of the reasons, by like a lot better, like a lot better. If you want to make the argument that Paolo could be as good as Shaq was on those Magic teams one day, I'm going to disagree with you. But even if that was the case, he isn't there now, so I don't think that's a fair comparison. The Derek White thing was more just a sect of NBA nerds. I think you're overblowing how much of that was actually the discussion. And I think a lot of the reason that was the discussion is because there was the discussion about the discussion. Like, should we consider guys like Derek White all-star tier? The discussion went beyond just Derek White is what I'm getting at. I don't really think Paolo's the most underrated player because I think a lot of the people who are big fans of Paolo, I think, overrate him. Is it fair to say that a lot of people outside of Paolo Banchero's fan base don't really give him due respect? Sure. Holistically, though, I think because so many people I do feel overrate him, like, there are people who will make direct comparisons to him and LeBron, even though they have completely different shot profiles. So no, I just don't think he's the most underrated player. If you want to say he's underrated, that's fine. All right, this is going to be the last take from Intro Vertical. I think whether you have Larry Bird or Magic Johnson all time, you have to have them besides each other. Example, either one at 4 and the other at 5, or one at 7 or the other at 6 or 8, etc. I don't think they separated themselves enough to have more players between them. Well, I would disagree simply on the basis that, and this is something I've been talking about a lot lately, that I think players 3 through 12 are mostly interchangeable in terms of all-time lists. So there's players who I think are pretty much on a similar level of talent and all-time standing to Larry Bird or Magic Johnson. I understand your argument of like they were very neck and neck with each other in their time, so they should be neck and neck in their all-time ranking. I think that makes some sense, but I think you can definitely put players between them. There's definitely players who are, in a similar ballpark in terms of all-time ranking, so it's fair enough to think one's better than Larry and one's a little bit worse than Magic, or vice versa, depending on where you stand. But for the most part, like, it'd be weird if you had Magic at 3 and Bird at 10. Like, that would be questionable. But, if you had Magic at 5 and Bird at 8, I don't think that's ridiculous. Or again, vice versa, depending on how you feel. With that said, that is it. Shout out to Nick for editing this video, and goodbye.